Welcome, Change Agents. I'm Kristen Brooks, Executive Director with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project out of the Riverside County Office of Education. Welcome to Mission Possible. On behalf of our team, I would like to thank you for engaging with us over the next 2 days to learn, network, and be inspired to push forward on the throttle for inclusion and equity in our school communities. We are excited you're here.
And I'm Kevin Schaefer, Director of Inclusive Practices with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project out of El Dorado County Office of Education. First, we'd like to wish all educators a very happy Teacher Appreciation Week. Hopefully, by now, you have had a chance to view the welcome video and explore the VFairs conference platform. If not, feel free to pop back into the lobby and click Get Started to watch the welcome video or visit the info desk for more information about how to navigate the virtual conference. Before I introduce our opening speaker, a few more logistics. This session and each session thereafter will be recorded and archived on the conference agenda after the conference for 1 month. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The interpretation icon in the same area will provide access to Spanish translation. We will ensure the ASL interpreters are spotlighted along with the presenters. Please feel free to interact using the chat and ask specific questions in the Q&A option. And don't forget to join the Let's Talk About Inclusion chat room using the blue tab on the right side of your screen, or click on the link in the social lounge. And now, I'd like to introduce Heather Calomese, Director of the Special Education Division at the California Department of Education. Heather?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to the SIP team, and good morning to everyone and welcome. Just a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time to join in community and as collaborators in the first annual Inclusion Conference. We know that the complex concepts of least restrictive environment and inclusion are dynamic, complex, and nuanced, and we're so happy that you have made the commitment to join us over the next couple of days to, one, I think, engage in an opportunity that we have here to continue our dialogue, elevate promising practices on inclusive policy, inclusive practices, culture, and shared leadership. Again, what we do know is inclusive practices are really a synthesis of these key components that I mentioned above, and really each component is worthy of a day-long conference of their own. So why does inclusion matter? The research shows us that inclusive classrooms far outweigh the benefits of segregating children with and without disabilities. For children with disabilities, inclusive settings offer more opportunity for interaction with peers. And for children without disabilities, inclusive settings generate more positive attitudes towards children with disabilities. And also compared to children in special education classrooms, children who spend more time in inclusive settings tend to make more gains in literacy and math and language skills than their typically developing peers as well. And we know from research, however, that merely putting children in inclusive classrooms is not sufficient, and that specific practices do matter. And I should also say that while there is an LRE continuum, there's a continuum for a reason, and that for some students with disabilities, their supports and services are best provided in a separate setting, but even then, school teams should be looking for ways to provide meaningful opportunities for engagement with their peers. Wanted to also just highlight a couple of the sort of budget investments that have been occurring over the past 2 years in the state of California. It's really exciting to know that the state of California continues to double down on its investments in terms of improving the outcomes for students with disabilities. And so this year, the proposed budget, it proposes an additional $300 million to increase the California state preschool adjustment factors to better support students with disabilities and dual language learners. And these funds will support the new requirements for state preschool providers to serve at least 10% of students with disabilities, and also provide additional supportive services for dual language learners as well. There'll be a requirement for our California State Preschool program to serve at least 10% of children with an IEP, similar to our Head Start programs. And then the budget proposes an additional $500 million one-time Prop 98 general fund to support the Inclusive Early Education Expansion Program, otherwise known as EAP, which funds the infrastructure and professional development necessary to support general and special education students in inclusive classrooms. At CDE, we also, and if you've watched a number of our presentations over the course, be it a board meeting or an advisory council meeting, we know that LRE is, at least restrictive environment, serves as the foundation of our theory of action for improvement of outcomes of students with disabilities. And in that foundation of LRE, what we mean by that is that students are placed and are being supported in the right educational environment. They are given the appropriate supports and services to meet their needs, and provided high quality instruction utilizing best practices for inclusion. And what we hope to see is increased learning, a positive impact on school culture, and a direct impact on graduation and post-school achievement outcomes for our students with disabilities. And finally, the special education, early education, and multilingual supports divisions at CDE share a common commitment to cross-division work by regular meetings to ensure alignment and a focused effort on a number of areas, including inclusive practices. So again, thank you so much. The energy that you're bringing to the chat in this conference is amazing. Please keep it up. We are so looking forward to, again, an action-packed and a wonderful 2 days filled of insights and dialogue, and really a focus and spotlight on our students and improving those outcomes as well. So again, I'll turn it back over to the SIP team as well and take it away, and looking forward to the dialogue ahead. And again, thank you so much for being here with us today. And again, we'll hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate you kicking us off this morning and inspiring us to move forward in California. Thank you for your leadership and being here with us today. At this time, it is my absolute honor to welcome Judy Heumann live from Washington, D.C. for an open and authentic conversation. We'll start with a bit about Judy's bio, then dive into our discussion with some guided questions to get into the insight of the mind and vision of our disability rights warrior. Please feel free to engage in the chat and the Q&A. Kevin will be collecting questions to pose for our participants toward the end of our time together. So a bit about Judy. Judy is a lifelong advocate for the rights of disabled people. She has been instrumental in the development and implementation of legislation and some things you may have heard of: Section 504, the Individuals with Education Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Her memoir, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, co-authored by Kristen Joyner, was published in 2020. She's also featured in the Oscar-nominated documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, directed by James Lebrecht and Nicole Noonan. Judy produces a podcast called The Human Perspective, which features a variety of members from the disability community, so check it out. Judy serves on a number of nonprofit boards, including the American Association of People with Disabilities, the Disabilities Rights Education and Defense Fund, Humanity and Inclusion, Human Rights Watch, United States International Council on Disability, and Save the Children. She has 20 years of nonprofit experience working with various disability organizations, including being a founding member of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. Prior to starting the Judy Heumann LLC, she served in the Clinton administration and Obama administrations. So Judy, you have led an incredible life of advocacy and perseverance. So thank you for sharing with us today. We are honored and excited to have you joining us. This is a treat.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, but virtual is really great. So
we will take it, Judy, and hopefully in the future we'll have an opportunity to get together in person, because that would be even more dynamic. So, you know, this is just an open conversation with Judy Heumann, and so I'm excited to kick us off with just our first kind of guided question. When you were in school, when did you feel most included or excluded? What was that experience like?
So I think it's an important question, and I have to step back to say, when should I have been in school? So I should have been in school when I was 5 years old, but I actually never went to school till I was 9 years old. because when my mom took me to school, the principal said that I was a fire hazard and couldn't come to the school, and that the Board of Ed would provide an education, which they didn't do in kindergarten. And then in the first, second, third, and half of the fourth grade, I had 2.5 hours a week of a teacher coming to the house. So one day, an hour, and another day, an hour and a half. And then, as I describe it, for good behavior, they threw in an occupational therapist who came to teach me sewing. Then when I finally did start going to school, I was in segregated classes. So it wasn't until I was in high school that I actually started going to classes with non-disabled children. My first year of school, 3 of my 5 classes were only with disabled children, and the other 2 were regular classes. And then for the remaining 3 years, homeroom was only with disabled kids. So I mention all this because, you know, in my neighborhood, I was being integrated. I went to Hebrew school with non-disabled kids, Brownies, Girl Scouts. But where did I feel most comfortable? I think actually I had a discomfort for many years being in, I don't want to say like integrated settings. I think it was really because I was so much in segregated settings that it was difficult to begin to integrate, especially in school, because the classes are competitive. So in the small classes in high school, the 3 that I took, was very few kids, like 5 or something. But in the regular ed classes, it's in Brooklyn, New York, there were like 30. And I tell parents all the time and kids that one of the reasons why inclusive education is so important is obviously for the learning, but it's also being in these separate settings that are typically not competitive in the same sense that regular classes are, with larger class size and studying and speaking up in class and having to take exams. My teachers in high school would always tell my parents that I did well in the classroom speaking. I did my homework well, but I always had difficulty with tests because I was terrified of them, because it wasn't anything that I had ever had. So I think, you know, when we're looking at inclusive education, there's so many reasons why it's important. Obviously, one of them is, as you were saying earlier, or Heather was saying earlier, about the results that we've seen, both for disabled and non-disabled children. But I think we need to look more broadly than just the results of tests, although I clearly think that's important. But it's really how people are learning to socialize and acclimate. And teenage years are difficult for everybody. And so, at least for me, that being the main time when there was real inclusion going on, which wasn't real either, because couldn't really participate in after school activities unless your parent was able to drive you back and forth. So even activities where you might stay for a club or do other things, if you didn't live near the school, that wasn't possible either.
Yeah. So it sounds like your parents had a role in helping you be included in the community-based programs when they were able to. What else was their level of involvement? We know how important it is to have our families engaged in part of this kind of wraparound support for our students. So what was that like for your parents with their involvement?
So, you know, I think it's always important to remember that I was born in 1947. I had polio in 1949. It was the 1950s when I started going to school. So there was no 504, there was no IDEA, there was basically nothing with nothing. And they didn't expect that I was not going to be able to go to school because they saw it as their responsibility to make sure I got to school, but that didn't work out either. So they really continued to play an increasingly important role as role models for me, really. Also seeing that they never gave up. You know, my mom was like looking at how to get me into a program. Finally, when I did get into a program, even though it was segregated, she became friends with the assistant principal, and she was working with parents of other kids in the segregated classes. And I think there wasn't a PTA at that time for the special ed classes, but the mothers that were getting together, you could really see how all of the kids in that group really move forward in a more successful way than some other children because their parents were involved. And I think there was a push at that point to get us into high school, because what my mom and other parents were learning is if you had a physical disability, and really there are very few of the kids in the special ed classes who didn't have cerebral palsy. Most of the kids had cerebral palsy, physical disabilities, as well as some speech and some intellectual. But no one had ever graduated from those classes and gone to high school. What happened at that point is the children became young adults. They left when they were 21 and went to sheltered workshops. So it was my mom and the moms of people in my age group that really pushed the Board of Ed to get some of the high schools to be made accessible. And so we all went to high schools instead of going on to home instruction. So I would say to the parents in the audience, as well as the teachers and administrators, that the role of the parents is age appropriate, very important. And the reason why I say age appropriate is obviously parents have a responsibility for your children while they're minors, and you're not being cut out even when they're over 18. But it is important, I think, that we look at expectations that we have for our children, whether they have disabilities or not. And I think that was something that was also very important for me and other friends of mine, that there were expectations, not just for school and learning and studying, but also discussions about the future, thinking about what experiences, as you were saying, Kristen, my parents, when I couldn't go to school, didn't make my life my bedroom with the table where my mother taught me. But at 3 o'clock, I went to Hebrew school or to Brownies, or my brothers and I all took piano lessons or playing in the neighborhood. So they were very conscious of wanting to make sure that I really saw myself as being a part of the community. Although I have to say that clearly not being either in school or being in segregated classes, where I clearly knew the learning that was going on was not equivalent to what my brothers or friends or cousins were learning. And all of those things were giving very mixed messages. It's a little bit better today, but still not really seeing disabled children in children's books to a great degree or on television, and not really having the same discussions with disabled children. In some cases, even if they're in integrated classes, you know, talking about people's futures. It's important for kids to be able to see themselves when they think about a future. So, you know, are you in fact making sure that when you're talking about careers, that you can make sure that people who are adults who may have a learning disability or autism or blindness or deafness or physical disabilities or mental health, whatever it may be, that they are a part of the discussions, not just, adults who appear not to have a disability. I think that's really important for children and young adults to be able to have, the question is role models. Who's your role model? I didn't really have a lot of role models when I was growing up. I didn't know other adults with disabilities. And I think that's something that we know for Black children, brown children, on and on. Seeing yourselves is very important. Not only yourself.
Yeah. And would you say that that's what motivated you to become a teacher and then, continue your advocacy? So you shared a great story about, first being a second grade teacher for the first time. Will you share that for our folks on the line?
Yeah. So, I think one of the reasons I wanted to be a teacher is because my family was from Germany, and on my father's side of the family, my mom's too, but my mother's side was much smaller. They all lost people in the Holocaust, but everybody on my father's side of the family were butchers. But the children born in the US, nobody was a butcher, but they were basically all teachers, high school teachers, mostly high school teachers, actually. And so I think I was learning through them about teaching is good. I valued teaching. And, but when I started thinking about it more, I also didn't see other people like myself teaching. So it was, yeah, I don't know what job I want. Teaching, I like working with kids. And so thought, okay, I'll major in education. But my friends with disabilities in high school said, don't tell the Department of Rehabilitation that you want to be a teacher, because they're going to say, show me a teacher who is teaching from a wheelchair. And I didn't know anybody. So I majored in speech therapy and I minored in education. At that point in time, you only needed to have 12 credits in education. You had to pass the same tests. So all of the tests were given in inaccessible buildings. I passed the written exam, the oral exam. They failed me on the medical exam because of paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis. So if you read my book, you'll see that I get a lawyer, we go to court, and we get Constance Baker Motley, who was the first African-American woman on a federal bench. And she basically directed the Board of Ed to give me another medical exam, and then I got my job. I taught 3 years before I left Brooklyn and came to California, but in those 3 years, I taught 1 year special ed and 2 years regular ed. And the second year teaching, I had my own class. And they had lost my records, meaning I had no idea how many kids were coming in my class, and I had no idea what their background was. And so the day came when all kids were coming into school, and I realized that I had never been in a second grade class in my entire life, because I'd never been in a regular classroom until high school. And that in and of itself was a very jarring experience, and things that you don't necessarily think about. But, if you were a student in a school that had 15, 20, 25, 30 kids in a classroom, even though you wouldn't have been the teacher as a kid, you still would have been used to being in an environment with a lot of kids. In the special ed classes, there were 8 or 10 kids. So there was nothing. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I don't know how many kids are coming in.
They keep coming in.
36 kids came in. I guess one other little point too is when I got the records for the kids, one of the one of the children, the only comment that the teacher had made about the child was UGH. And I remember how appalled I was at that. He had, I presume today we would say he had some learning disabilities or ADHD or both, but he was a very nice kid. And I just think, you know, these kinds of messages where children are, I mean, a 7-year-old child calling them an UG, and the impression that that gives to whoever their teacher is going to be, you know, it's already saying that this child is a problem. And I think that does adversely affect our ability in the classroom.
Absolutely. You know, we pass those messages on, and that is so damaging, you know, instead of switching it to, you know, a more positive light and what students are able to do. So, you know, I want to say that we've come a long way since then, right? But what do you think has really hindered our progress? How come we haven't made the strides and we're not in the place where we really want to be with inclusion and equity? What do you think is holding us up?
I mean, I think there are many issues. I think universities need to be doing a better job of training general ed and special ed teachers to see the classrooms of today being more inclusive, so that both general ed and special ed teachers have the academic training that they need, and also the ability for teachers to learn how to work together. I think we also need to be doing more work with parents, supporting parents. Right now, I think too frequently parents may feel like they have to come armored to be able to go into a meeting, because not always, but in many cases, issues of placement and services are things that can be contentious. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be disagreements, that people can't work on those disagreements, but I think, you know, a parent coming into a meeting with multiple people is very intimidating. And you want to be able to feel that you're all on the same page. And that page does include a future for the child and looking at what needs to happen. So I don't think that happens frequently enough. I also feel that both the federal and state governments are not doing enough on monitoring and compliance, because I think there are many issues that are going on that are not being addressed. And in the end, it's disabled children, of course, and non-disabled children. But right now we're focusing in this discussion on how to help ensure that disabled children can be successful in school. So I think monitoring and compliance is very important. Programs like SIP, I think, are obviously a commitment on the part of the state to be driving technical assistance forward, but more needs to happen. I think public education itself, and California clearly is a state that does value public education, but I think we need more money in public education, not just to allow a disabled kid in the classroom, but to ensure that children in poor school districts are getting the same level of education as children in wealthier school districts with and without disabilities. And that certainly doesn't happen any place in the country yet. So I think those are some of the issues, but also evaluating the role of the disabled child. And as the child is getting older, beginning to get that child involved in their IEP and thinking about a future, because I think that's really important. So looking at what we're doing to ensure that disabled students are a part of, if you have mentoring days, if you have opportunities where work is a part of what students may be doing in high school, that disabled kids are a part of all of that. And that we consciously recognize that not just disabled children, but kids who come from poor backgrounds frequently are not getting the same opportunities as others. And we need to look at what has to happen to help elevate opportunities for kids in middle school and high school so they can look at advancing into training programs, community college, universities, and really get a better understanding of the world of work for tomorrow. I think that's something that everyone, not just in the area of disability, but too frequently, I feel that disabled children and young adults are not getting the same opportunities as non-disabled children. They're not learning enough in STEM. They're not being given opportunities to utilize technology and really be able to be prepared for the jobs of the future. And I'm talking also about kids who have significant disabilities. So I think we need to be truly believing and looking at models that are showing that kids with significant disabilities can in fact achieve. There's some great changes that have gone on in California is involved with some of those, where some of the colleges now have programs where students with intellectual and developmental disabilities are participating. Parents need to know about those programs way earlier than they do. And I think teachers need to know about them also, because I think it's important for teachers to learn about things that they may never have their hands on, but learning about the impact of other programs and enabling children and parents to get exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know our team talks a lot about moving beyond tolerance and acceptance. You know, those are sort of things of the past, and those were great first steps, but now we're at the point of value add and closing the opportunity gap and really opening things up for all students. And as you mentioned, we're not just talking about students with, you know, mild, moderate disabilities. We're talking about the whole range of students and really all marginalized populations when we're talking about opportunity and lifting folks up. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'd love to open it up to the participants on the line for our last 15 minutes together. Kevin, were you able to capture? I saw the chat going wild with lots of yays, and thank you, Judy. But some questions maybe that we can pose for Judy to answer on the line with us.
Absolutely. There's great questions in the Q&A and in the chat. The first one, what is something we could do at the state level? At the state policy level that will help shift practice and increase inclusion for students with disabilities?
Adhere to the law. Get teachers the training they need. Have principals and administrators really be able to proactively look. I think, you know, principals and administrators need to also learn about practices in other school districts in California or outside of California, and looking at ways that people can learn so that they're leading, you know, by examples, and they then can become an example too as things are changing. But I think it's critically important that the leadership in the school district believe that disabled children with various forms of disabilities can be of value and are of value in the classroom, and that we need to look at what types of training and supports teachers may need for that to occur. But if you come in with a view that a child is an UG, and UG may not be the word you use, but it's maybe, well, this child's not going to benefit, so I can't waste my time. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to change. So peer groups, principals to principals, superintendents to superintendents. But again, I think, you know, the state supporting the SIP program is very important. And I'll look at how that's also being reinforced at the school level. And being able to have open dialogue about what needs to be happening more.
Looks like we have a lot of answers to that question in the chat too. So I appreciate everyone's interactions. Another question that was asked in the Q&A is, were there any issues with students or parents accepting a teacher with a disability?
Not that I heard of.
No, not in your experience?
I mean, I'm not saying, listen to what I said. I'm not saying that they weren't, but I'm just saying that it was never brought to my attention. You know, I had a child come to a holiday party where the parent said, tell your sick teacher to have a Merry Christmas.
Wow.
And I said, to her, tell your mom, have a happy Hanukkah, and that your teacher is not sick. So whether or not a 7-year-old was able to transmit that message or even understood it. But, I think at that time when I was in Brooklyn, they're also, doing our best to keep parents engaged. So I did a lot of work. I held open school night. We had it twice a year. And at that time, the first semester, there was an open school afternoon and an evening. And in the second semester, it was only afternoon. And I did an evening also. And I had an after school program in the classroom. And I sent a letter home to all the kids, to all the parents, with my home phone number to say, if there's anything that you need, please feel free to call me. So I think I tried from the very beginning to be, I didn't identify in the letter that I had a disability. But, if the parents came to school, they saw obviously that I was in a wheelchair, and I'm sure their kids said something about, oh, I have a teacher in a wheelchair, but nothing ever came back to me negatively.
And it
Great
seems as though
questions like, do you sleep in your wheelchair? How do you go to the bathroom? Those are the
Kids are
questions.
curious, right? Kids are really curious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They have
They'll
the
be
same
direct.
questions. They have the same questions adults have, but adults won't ask.
And it sounds like it's a shared experience. Just reading through the chat, there's a number of comments about the experiences of teachers with disabilities that they've faced in discrimination in the educational system. Another question in the Q&A is, how do we address the long-held belief that students with significant intellectual disabilities are best taught in specialized settings?
Again, I think it's sharing information with teachers who've successfully had kids with more significant disabilities in their classrooms with appropriate supports, who can talk about the value not only for the student, but for the class, and where the teachers can talk about the benefit for all of the students. I think it's really, again, looking for examples. There's an example in Massachusetts from a while ago that's still around called the O'Hearn School. The O'Hearn School is really a great example. There was a teacher who was losing their vision, and they went to the Board of Ed to get information on how to continue to teach. And they told him he should go on disability. And he said he didn't want to go on disability. And he actually became a principal as he was losing his vision. And he went into a school in a district that was very underperforming. And Massachusetts is a choice school. So his school was also underpopulated. But after he was there a number of years, they brought in more disabled kids than typically occurred. He had told the district or the special ed office that they would take more children, and the kids were integrated and they did great holistic work in the school. And as I said, it's still a school of note today. So I think people need to meet people, visit places, talk to people, really get some real life examples of what is happening, the benefit for everyone, and not to paint it that there aren't issues, because obviously you want to be able to discuss what the problems are and how to address them in an open way.
And isn't it that Stanford study that talked about stories are 22 times more powerful than data alone? So sharing, celebrating those stories, lifting them up. It's such a shame that we're often surprised how well kids do in inclusive settings. Like, wow, look at little Johnny, he's thriving. It's like, gee, if we had presumed competence from the beginning, and set up the system for our students, wow, look at what they can do. So
I remember when I worked in the Clinton administration, as you mentioned. So I visited many, many schools. And I remember one day I was in a classroom and there was a student with Down syndrome. And the teacher was like, oh, one of the things is so-and-so is learning how to read. And I thought that might well not have happened in a segregated class. She as the teacher or he as the teacher were learning that by putting energy and knowledge with this child, that the child was learning like other children.
Mm. Judy, do you have the name of the school that you referenced earlier?
It's now called the Henderson School.
Henderson School, great. We have a really broad question in the Q&A, Judy. What is your picture of a fully inclusive school, and what will it take to realize this vision?
For me, a fully inclusive school is one where the leadership from the top down believes that inclusion works. I've also seen in a number of schools that I had visited where when the principal had a good background in special ed in a regular school, that also positively impacted the school overall because the principals were problem solvers. I'm not saying that principals who don't have a special ed background can't do the same, but it's just been noticeable for me when I was visiting schools to see that. So leadership and knowledge is very important. And respect and inclusion of parents and training of teachers. And obviously resources are important. And being able to not use quote unquote lack of resources as an excuse to put kids in segregated classes where we know they're not going to succeed. So funding overall in education is a challenge, and disabled children and their needs need to be a part of that mix. An agreement that all kids can learn, and having more knowledge about who are the kids that we have previously thought are unable to learn because they have X disability or they come from whatever their background may be. Bringing in good technical assistance that can be helping do problem solving if there are children who need additional supports or needing to look at ways of making accommodations that will work, not just for the student, but in many ways for the children overall. And I think, one of the values of reforming education from a truly inclusive perspective is that it also has an impact in the communities. Because the parents of non-disabled children, I had a parent tell me once, I will never let my child go to a school again where kids with disabilities are in separate classes. This is a parent who, the school at that time was called the O'Hearn School. She said, my kids had been in one or two other schools where they had segregated classes, and they could choose if they wanted to go and visit the kids in the special ed classes. She said, in the school that they were going to, when I was visiting, the kids were just in the classrooms. They were a part of everything. And so the children weren't seeing the disabled kids as, hold on one second, please. Sorry. So I think that was a very powerful statement from me, from this mother who completely recognized that in this new school program, where the kids were included, that it was beneficial to all. And she saw that when her children saw disabled kids as not being integrated in the school, that they had a different perception of who they were.
Wow, Judy, you have led and continue to lead an incredible life of perseverance, as we talked about before, and advocacy. You're an individual with a disability. You are a teacher and advocate. What what words of advice, we've talked a lot about what systems could look like, but if you were to send folks off as we close our session at 9:50 here and move on to the rest of our conference, what would be some motivating last words to send folks off with to keep the work moving forward, to keep lifting up individuals with disabilities and opening opportunities and that top-down leadership that's needed and parent support? What would you say to folks on the line as they move through the next couple of days?
Speak up, speak out, be critical, be demanding of yourself and others. Look at what you've known in the past and where you are now and what would have helped you feel more confident about what you were able to do, and use that as something when talking to universities or looking at what you believe you need in the classroom from new people, student teachers, as well as new teachers. And I think be committed. And I know teaching is really a very arduous job. And teachers, to me, are obviously so fundamental to our democracy. So be the leaders that you are. And it can be difficult, you know, I know if you're in an environment where your visions are not being respected the way you want. But I think also, how are your unions representing you? Are they representing inclusive education as you want? And look at the progress that you do continue to make and keep articulating your visions for the future. Be strong.
Thank you, Judy. I love that. And I don't know if you're watching the chat, just click away, but people are just so motivated by your work and your words and just leading by example. So we cannot thank you enough for engaging with us. I know it's California to Washington, DC, but we are very hopeful that next time it is in person. We're going to continue to follow your work and be inspired by you. So thank you again so much for joining us. For everyone on the line, we are going to end our session here, and please join us with DJ BJ Diamond. In the next session begins at 10 o'clock. So jump into the lobby, check out the agenda, click on some music before our session begins at 10 o'clock. Thank you again, Judy. Just an honor and a pleasure. You have kicked off the conference exactly the way we needed it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Talk again. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you. And thank you to our interpreters so much for the access.